What's up guys, and in today's video I'm going to be going through my anti-fragile system for thinking. Like always with these videos, the main mission is to show how builds roll and real, to show you the good, the bad, the ugly, what it is that I'm actively implementing in terms of mental models and frameworks, and how we're scaling those frameworks into the future. Also to solve what hurts within businesses and organizations, basically to come in and be the chief problem solvers and ultimately build back-end infrastructure while we're at it. And also just to call in visionaries, basically the people that are aligned with what it is that we're actively striving to solve for, which is chaos, and ultimately to build a network of cool people doing cool things at the same time. So today you can probably tell that I don't have my glasses, so please excuse me. My glasses decided to break just before I recorded this video, so I'm having a bit of trouble seeing, but just bear with me. So yeah, so most people, so this is going to be a super fun one. Like always, my anti-fragile system for thinking, I like to take the approach of always asking the questions of what could possibly go wrong, and that's why I see most people unknowingly design their systems and their thinking to be fragile. And what I mean by this is that they cling on to the illusion of control, plan for when the outcome is quote unquote perfect, and they are thrown into chaos when reality decides otherwise. Basically to say, hey, you plan for a scenario in a situation where the system that you're designing and building is ultimately going to work, and you have this idea that each and every moving thing that you're building towards the system is ultimately going to work, and you ultimately don't plan for any contingencies in case things go wrong. You have this fragile mindset, and I like to think about to say, hey, my system for thinking is ultimately saying, hey, what is the worst case scenario? And the problem with having this approach of, hey, this system that we're building is ultimately going to be perfect, in a sense it's always just going to work, that's where it comes in to say, hey, fragile thinking creates stress, burnout, and missed opportunities, because the moment reality deviates from the plan, you're done. And I think one of the most important things, especially along my journey, that has been super important, and I think it's just me as a person, that I always plan, I always like to take the approach of what could possibly go wrong in every situation. I know it's not always the best thing, but I think in systems thinking, in terms of my thinking, this anti-fragile way of thinking, I think it's super valuable in order to say, hey, whatever we're building, whatever we possibly are encountering into the future, it could ultimately go wrong any point in time. So how do we have contingency plans around it? Say, hey, like right now we're working on a product fixes that we're making, so one of our developers is ill at the moment. So how can we actively have this contingency plan to say, hey, if we have one developer that's not actively on the front line, what can we actively do? Do we have a backup? Do we have a Rolodex of people that we trust, that we can actively call upon to say, hey, we have this Rolodex of developers that have XYZ skill sets, so we actively just calling upon them to come in and just ultimately fix what it is that needs to be fixed, and making sure that, hey, we're just constantly just moving as fast as we should be, because like I have been saying for the past couple videos, you only move as fast as your slowest as your constraint. So ultimately understanding that, hey, for me, fragile, having that fragile mindset in the sense of saying, hey, every single thing is gonna be perfect, so we're not gonna plan for when things go wrong, is a bit delusional in my opinion. Because if you're constantly building things, especially when it comes to what we're building in terms of back-end infrastructure, the one of the things that are gonna happen is things are gonna break, and they ultimately you're gonna need contingency plans in place in order to understand that, hey, we're actively having this frame of thinking that if something goes wrong, we already adapt as quickly as possible. Because I've learned along my journey the hard way. In the past, I over engineered perfect plans only to watch them crumble under unexpected events. I've had times, so many times, countless times, where I had this perfect idea that, hey, XYZ was gonna work each and every single time. Most of the time, yes, it did work and it was perfect, but most of the other times that it didn't work, it was horrible. It was one of the things that I was like, hey, if I had planned this a lot better and I had continued contingency plans, we could have, ultimately done that, and it would have, yielded us a better outcome in the long term. But hey, these are just things that, you have to learn. And now that, I've learned them, I ultimately understand that, hey, these are the certain things that I had to go through in order to build this anti-fragile mindset, where each and every way that I approach certain situations is what could possibly go wrong and how can I plan for it. Because I think if you have that mindset, that inversion thinking in a sense, that hey, we're actually solving what is stopping the growth and not actually focusing on the things that you seem to need to be focusing on to grow. And what I mean by this is saying, hey, if we want to grow, most people say, hey, if we want to grow, we need to get more clients, book more calls, we need to do all these things. But what if that's not the problem, and we now introduce inversion thinking when we say, hey, what if the thing that's stopping you from making XYZ profits, more profits, is ultimately your back-end infrastructure that is slowing you down simply because you're not communicating with the clients, you're not keeping them on long term, simply the LTV is not there. So it's ultimately saying, hey, we need to understand that, hey, we're actively just planning for when things go wrong. Because in life, I've seen countless times, when you have this, perfect idea of things going, perfectly, and things just going wrong, it happens. And ultimately, for me, I just want to build this mental fortitude of this, anti-fragile mindset to say each and every situation, we have a backup. We're ultimately able to say, hey, if XYZ goes wrong, we have these strategies in place that ultimately allow us to not be done when something unexpected happens. And I think even it wasn't, for me personally, it wasn't until I began shifting towards an anti-fragile way of thinking that everything changed. Because now my mindset's like, hey, if XYZ goes wrong, I'm not going to be fragile in the sense that everything breaks. I'm just going to be having that mental fortitude that, hey, things are going wrong, okay, cool, how can I actively just solve this? And just solving problems, I think builds that moat that, hey, whatever problems come your way, you ultimately are able to solve them in every sense. And I think for me, along my journey, I think I haven't gone too deep in it about my journey and what it is that I have done in the past. But ultimately, from just building websites in the beginning, and just also just selling sweets back in the day, I think just having that fragile mindset of, hey, if someone does not buy from you, that's okay. And one of the most important things as well, which I've not actually shared before, I don't think so, which is like, hey, you have a client and then the client leaves unexpectedly, and you have this anti-fragile mindset of saying, hey, okay, cool, he's left, what can we actively do? And I think that saves you a lot. It saves you a lot of stress, because you're always like, hey, there's more fish in the sea, like there's more fish that you can actively just rope in to work with you. And ultimately saying, hey, if XYZ doesn't want to partner with us, that's okay. How can we actively just keep pushing forward and moving forward each and every single day? Because if you have this, this perfect idea that, hey, this one client, we're actively just going to sign them today and they're going to take us to XYZ, and all these perfect things are going to happen, and you don't plan for when things go wrong, ultimately, yeah, you're going to have that fragile mindset to say, hey, when XYZ goes wrong, now you're going to spiral. And you don't want that. And for me, this is one of the things that I've been actively implementing each and every single day to say, hey, how can I actively have this anti-fragile mindset in terms of my thinking? Because that long term, I think ultimately builds the moat that, allows us to then reach the next level. Because each and every single time we look at a situation and say, what's the worst possible thing that can happen? And how can we actively build contingency plans around it so that when it does happen, that, hey, we're not stuck, we're not having everything breaking at once and we don't know what to do. Because I think when you lose control and you don't know what is going on, that is the worst feeling. Even in just building systems, when you completely don't have control, I think that is the worst part, because you simply don't have control. And I think even building systems or building anything, I think control is one of the most important modes, because with control you can then tweak the system and understand that, hey, if we do XYZ, then into the future it's going to respond in XYZ manner. And I think that's also super important. But also how I'm actively implementing this in terms of anti-fragile thinking, I think is also super important. So through this, I'm actively planning, doing this through planning, scenario planning, where I map out the best, worst, and most likely outcomes. So I don't just look at it from, hey, what is the best possible outcomes, which is good to focus on 100%. It's always good to focus on the best possible outcomes, but also asking the questions of, hey, if this isn't the if this outcome that we have that is the best possible outcome does not come to fruition, what other outcomes are possible, and what other outcomes or wild cards could they possibly be that we need to also take into account. So saying, hey, why don't we just run this thought process of saying, hey, what if, all the possible outcomes that we've mapped out, what if none of them come to fruition and the most random thing comes out? Say, for example, a unicorn just pops up, and then ultimately we are adapting that mindset of saying, hey, even if a unicorn does pop up, we're ultimately, aren't destroyed by that, but we're ultimately just able to keep pushing the needle forward each and every single day. And I think moving forward each and every single day is one of those things that you just need to have in your DNA, because each and every single day you're going to have to face new challenges and ultimately just keep pushing forward. And I think this is super important, and this is where, having this anti-fragile mindset comes to fruition, because hey, if you're going to come through problems and challenges and you're not going to be able to understand that, hey, we need to have a contingency plan, I'm mapping out the worst case scenario and the best case scenario and the other possible outcomes, then you're ultimately going to have this fragile mindset where, hey, if something goes wrong, you're not going to know what to do. And that is the worst possible way to go about things, in my opinion, because then you don't have control. And I think having control of the situation in most cases is ultimately the thing that you need to be closest to, because if you have more control, even if you have 1% control, it's still something that you can actively just move towards. You may not be able to control the situation directly, but what about yourself as well? And that's where it comes in of saying, hey, and build a lightweight plan for each. Like I said, just having contingency plans that, hey, if this goes well, then XYZ, we're planning for that. If it doesn't go well, then XYZ, we're planning for that as well. And saying, hey, that way, no matter what happens, I have direction. And like I said, direction and control and vision, all of those, to me, they're all just, aligned in one sense to say, hey, if you have vision, you have direction, and you ultimately have control as well. Because if you have control, if you have direction, you ultimately have control of where you're going to be going. And even to some degree, you can say, hey, you may not have the vision in that point in time, simply because there's a lot of mental fog that comes because things aren't going your way, and that's okay. That's okay. We all have those points in times where things are super unclear, but I think taking a step back and just gaining that level of clarity has been the most that has ultimately allowed for me to ultimately just keep pushing forward. And saying, hey, experimental loops, which are also super important. I run small low stake tests before committing big resources. If it fails, it fails cheaply, and if it works, I scale it. Ultimately saying, hey, if something works, like building an MVP, you need to spend as little as you possibly can, because if you're just pumping $10,000 into something that you've never tested and the market does not respond to it, ultimately that's throwing money down the drain. And how can I actively just run these thought processes and these experiment loops in a manner that is cheaply, and if it works, it works, and if it doesn't, ultimately we discard it, but at least we did it cheaply. And if it works, ultimately we just scale it and pump a lot more into it. For example, like if you're running ads and the ads aren't working and you've already pumped $10,000 in, for example, then ultimately you flush money down the drain. But also, if you've spent $10 and then ultimately those ads are pumping, and then you spend $1,000 and they're still pumping, and you scale it and they're still pumping, ultimately then you know that, hey, this experiment is actively, or these ad creatives that we're running are actively working. And through that, you also just also need to incorporate stress testing beliefs, where I actively challenge my own assumptions to find hidden weaknesses before reality exposes them, which is one of the most important things. I like to always challenge my frame of thinking and the way that I think on a day-to-day basis, because stress testing, even if you're building systems or databases or all those things, I think stress testing the machine is one of the most important tools that you need to be super deep on, especially in your life. You need to be able to stress test your endurance as well. I mean, doing hard things, I think, is what makes life exciting. Doing these 100-day videos, like, that's stress testing testing me and saying, hey, how can I actively, just keep recording when things go wrong? Like, for example, like my glasses just broke 2 minutes before I wanted to start this video. But ultimately, how can I keep pushing forward each and every single day? Even though, like, right now, to be honest with you, I'm struggling to see my screen at the moment and the notes that I made. I'm completely struggling, but ultimately, it's stress testing me, because ultimately I said, hey, like, I'm still gonna be committed to making these daily videos no matter what happens. I'm just gonna make sure that I'm just running and pumping these daily videos and doing my absolute best in this present moment in time, considering the situation that I cannot see properly at this present moment in time. And that also means that, hey, this system has allowed me, what it has allowed me to do, which is pivot from setbacks without panics. I've had multiple times where I've had multiple setbacks, people canceling, clients leaving unexpectedly, and just, getting finessed, if you will, and also just saying, hey, that ultimately did not cause panic from my internal system, because, the more it happens, or the more, you are stress tested as well, the more endurance you have, in my opinion. You just ultimately just become, more adept to handling these stress testing moments. And that's, even when projects collapse, because these things do happen, you just have to have that mindset of, how can I build this anti-fragile mindset that ultimately pushes me forward through the good times and the bad times as well. And saying, hey, it's also helped me navigate personal and business pressure with clarity. Just ultimately saying, hey, my personal life and business life, this has ultimately helped me navigate this through clarity, which is, one of the most important modes that I speak about in my previous video. If you guys haven't heard that, you can always check it out, where I say solitude is one of the most important things in terms of building that internal clarity. And sometimes you do need clarity, in order to push to the next level, rather than just keep on pumping the machine. And saying, hey, identify opportunities in volatile markets, and that others miss entirely. Saying, hey, this also just allows me to identify, opportunities that others may miss. But ultimately, because I have this, anti-fragile mindset of saying, hey, like, I'm just gonna push forward each and every single day, and make sure that we're actively building the machine each and every single day, and that we're also getting the level of clarity, I think ultimately allows you to see patterns in nature, and also, that ultimately allow you to create something new. And through this, you ask the question of, why is this all leverage? Which is, anti-fragility is more than resilience. It benefits from chaos, because chaos is ultimately always going to happen. And the more uncertain the world the more uncertainty the world throws at me, the more opportunities I find. Because I think, in the most stressful times, in the most, painstaking times, there's so much opportunities. There are so many opportunities in that present moment in time. It just becomes a question of, how can you actively see this? And I think the modes in which you're able to see this is ultimately through having this anti-fragile mindset of saying, hey, each and every single day, I'm just going to build, and nothing is going to, ultimately get me down to the levels where I stop building, and I'm never going to give up. Because I think, this is exactly how, the vision of Chaos Killer OS, or Killer Chaos OS, I like to call it interchangeably, is built. Because not only to withstand the disorder, but to grow because of it. It needs to make sure that, hey, each and every single day, the vision of Killer Chaos OS is building, and through this, anti-fragile mindset, we're actively just pumping each and every single day. Because this anti-fragile mindset is also, incorporates a different variety of different mental models that, I incorporate as well, which I really, really love, which are systems thinking and first principles, and combining that into, this anti-fragile mindset that I have to say, hey, what is the fundamental truth in why I'm feeling this XYZ way, and then reasoning up from there. And most of the time I found that, hey, the stock that, I'm actively, using or utilizing is ultimately, the flows that are ultimately governing it are ultimately, in my control some of the times. But ultimately, in order to, change that, it takes a lot of time and effort as well. And that, has ultimately allowed me to understand the lesson, which ties every single thing up here together, which is, you know, stop building systems and strategies that only work when not if nothing goes wrong. Build ones that thrive when things do. So ultimately saying, hey, build systems that ultimately thrive when things go right, and not just build, you know, in this manner of saying, hey, if things go wrong, we don't know what to do. But we're actively taking this approach of saying we're building, but we're also making contingency plans because things can go wrong at any point in time. But we're actively just making sure that we're just pumping the machine each and every single day by gathering the level of clarity that allows us to get to the next stage. But through this, I think this has yielded me so much, you know, in my journey, and so much that, you know, I would speak to in a separate video, you know, just, you know, sharing more about how this anti-fragile system, you know, has helped me in terms of my thinking, and just ultimately just stress test me, scenario planning in terms of scenario planning, and also just experimental loops, because I always just run experimental loops to say, hey, how can I actively just stress test this and run this experiment, and also just map it out as well, in that order, to say mapping out and then running the experiment and then stress testing it and saying, hey, each and every single day, we're not going to give up the vision of Killer Chaos OS. We're going to make sure that we're just pumping, you know, the knowledge that we're gathering each and every single day to make sure that we're getting closer and closer to the vision of Killer Chaos OS. And that for me is exciting, because we're going to be, you know, the main goal, like I always say in my videos towards the end, is inspiring millions of people, and also just, you know, redefining or reshaping industries and having $100 million worth of impact into the future. I know that we're still far, we're going to make so many mistakes, but ultimately, you know, the way that we gather these data points and these set of actions is through just building this. And I know that into the future, we're going to get one step closer each and every single video. For example, like today, I just cannot see it, so please forgive me. I just cannot see. And if you guys want to connect with me, make sure to connect with me on X, LinkedIn, Instagram, and I will see you guys in the next video.